Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. We are going to get started in just a minute here. My name is Alexandra Alvarado. I'm the Director of Education here at AAOA. Before we begin, though, I did want to start with a couple of things. Number one, this entire webinar and the recording, as well as any handouts I'm going to reference, are going to be sent to you tomorrow. So be sure to be on the lookout for that. It will be sent to you in an email. And also, there is a question box on the right side of your screen. So if you have questions during the webinar, or if you have questions afterward, feel free to type them in there. We are going to have a Q&A. If I see some questions pop up that I can answer during the webinar, I'll go ahead and try and do that, but if not, we'll save that to the Q&A. The other thing, too, that I wanted to mention is we will be having these recordings available and past recordings available as well pretty soon in a webinar library. So definitely be on the lookout for that. So let's get started today. How to spot criminal records and identity fraud. So today's agenda, we're going to start with a quick introduction as to why this is important. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of crimes that could possibly come up in a search. We'll talk about 5 common misconceptions about background searches. And these are things that new landlords don't know and even experienced ones don't know either. So these are really great to know if you're trying to get good background searches. And then 6 sneaky tenant tactics. So what are tenants doing to hide their criminal records if they have any? We'll go over some of the common ones that we see and hear about. And then we'll talk about HUD guidelines. So that's the Housing of Urban Development. We'll talk about those guidelines on how to use criminal background checks to make a tenant screening decision. And lastly, we'll end with a Q&A. The whole thing should be about 30 minutes and then Q&A for about 10 or 15 minutes depending on how many questions you guys have. All right, let's get started. So why is a criminal search important? I know this might be obvious to some of you guys, but I just want to reiterate why it is important. So I was actually looking up some statistics, and I found that the FBI says that there's close to 78 million Americans that have a criminal record at some point in their past. So that is a lot of Americans, but don't let that alarm you. A lot of these aren't violent crimes necessarily, but regardless, if you're a landlord, you want to know what type of crime your potential tenant has committed so you can make a decision on that. So was it a DUI 7 years ago? Or was it a physical assault a couple months ago? So this is for, number one, the safety of you, your property, and neighbors or other tenants if you have a multifamily unit or if you're a property manager. So this leads me to the next point. Fiduciary duty of due diligence. So what is this exactly? Well, under the law, every landlord owes the duty of doing their due diligence to keep their visitors, guests, and neighbors as safe as possible. So what counts as due diligence? Well, we can say this. A criminal search is one of the clearest ways to show that you made a fair attempt to uncover any possible past crimes and then made a decision based on safety. So the more you can show your due diligence, the less liable you will be as a landlord should anything go wrong. The third here, indicator of future behavior. It's not always true, but past criminal behavior, especially a pattern of frequent criminal behavior, can be an indicator of future behavior. So depending on the type of crime, you'll need to assess how that might pose a risk to your tenants. So of course it's important to get the full story from the tenant to determine if they have actually done something to help their lives and improve, but it's definitely something to look out for there. The bottom line is a first impression is not enough. Criminals are smart. They're good at hiding their past most of the time. So as a landlord, you shouldn't automatically dismiss a criminal, but it's definitely a red flag if they tell you they don't have one and then you find one. So unfortunately, you do really need to do your research in order to protect your home. So now I want to dive into the types of crimes. Now, I know this is something that a lot of you guys are aware of. You guys understand what these crimes are, but just to start, I want to go over some of these. The first one is an infraction. I'm guilty of one. A lot of you guys probably are. The most common one is a speeding ticket. So obviously not a big deal, not something dangerous necessarily. Here, littering, jaywalking, other examples. I included marijuana possession in this list because it's a pretty interesting one. It is changing, as you probably know, year by year. Basically, the laws are making some crimes for marijuana now infractions, and in some states like California, it's not even going to be an infraction anymore. So that's one to look out for if you do see it on someone's record, because it might not actually be relevant today under the new state laws. So the next crime here is a misdemeanor. So misdemeanor is basically any crime that is punishable by up to 1 year in prison, although it doesn't actually have to result in jail time. Some examples that are pretty common are like petty theft, disorderly conduct, reckless driving, possession of illegal drugs. So could this be a huge deal? Maybe, maybe not. You really want to talk to the tenant if you do see something like this. It could indicate some level of irresponsibility or maybe untrustworthiness, but typically these aren't going to be violent crimes. So from a safety standpoint, it's not usually a red flag. The next one is definitely a red flag. That's a felony. So these are going to be more serious crimes. These are the ones that people actually go to jail for. They're punishable for more than a year in prison, and that's going to be crimes like murder, rape, burglary, kidnapping, arson. So obviously these are the ones that you want to look out for. If you see these appear on any of your reports, feel free to give us a call and we'll confirm as well that it really is your tenant, but these are definitely ones you want to know about. The next one here is a federal terrorist search. So a lot of our members, they get kind of scared, obviously, when they see the word terrorist, and really it is a growing fear. We do get this report ordered quite often, but a lot of these crimes that come up in this search aren't terrorist crimes like you would think in the traditional sense. Those are probably less common, but really the important ones are federal crimes. And so federal crimes are actually going to be like your most wanted, your FBI, terrorist watch list. Federal crimes are governed by government agencies, or they're crimes that occur across state boundaries. So actually not all of them are going to necessarily be terrorist or violent crimes. There are some lists like the Health and Human Services exclusion list, for example. So that's people who've committed crimes that basically have barred them from the health industry. That's not necessarily what you would think of as a terrorist crime. That is, though, one of the databases that we search. In fact, we search hundreds of databases, and I included a list in the handouts that you can actually download that is pretty interesting. It shows you all the ones that we actually look at, all the databases, and we've color-coded them, so some of them are green to yellow, orange, and red. So you might want to take a look at that in case you ever do get one of those records coming back. It's interesting to know that not all of these crimes are terrorist crimes in the traditional sense. All right, and so now approaching the last type of crime, the sex offender crime. You guys are probably familiar with the Megan's Law. So basically that means that people who are convicted of these sex crimes, they have to register as sex offenders. So what I want to say here is a note for you to be aware of is that there is no automatic registration when it comes to sex offenders. So just because somebody committed the crime, unless they actually register themselves, they don't get put into this database. So it's important here to know that it's up to them to do it. There are consequences if they don't do it. So most likely they will. But here is another caveat too, is there's legal limits on disclosures. So you'll see this theme kind of happen throughout this webinar is states vary with what laws they have on disclosures. So what should be disclosed to the public and what should not. There is no nationwide sex offender database. Each state has their own database. So they get to control what information should get reported and what should not, and the amount of time it should be on there. So that's going to vary per state, but with AAOA, we do search all the sex offender databases at one time to get that information. So now it starts to get a little interesting. We have 5 common misconceptions. We hear these all the time, and so I wanted to go over them to make sure that you all don't have these same misconceptions about criminal background checks. So the number 1 common misconception we see is that there is a single nationwide database with all the criminal information that you would ever want to know. Unfortunately, that's not true. So obviously this would make our job a lot easier, but unfortunately criminal information is very fragmented from state to state. So some states consider something a misdemeanor, others consider it a felony. Some states don't disclose all of the information about a criminal. Maybe they only disclose like name and date of birth and not social. And that's pretty common. So basically, when we're doing a search, we're searching many, many databases at one time. So that's why it's important to have a reliable background screening service like ours. Basically, it's a connection that allows as much information as possible to be searched online, and then we build out basically filters to get the most accurate results to you. If you were to do this on your own, if a single person were to do this, it would take them months to be able to search what we can in seconds. The second misconception here is that arrest records and pending records count. In other words, that if somebody's arrested, then people believe that that should come up in their criminal background check. And we get calls from people who are sometimes a little angry that they don't see that, and they know that that person's been arrested. But the thing is you have to ask, was he or she actually found guilty? And the question here, and the answer to the question really is, well, we don't know if they were or if they were not. And that's not just our approach because we think it's fair. It really is a part of the law, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which I'm going to send you a link to after the webinar, is basically an act that has regulations on how we and you should be using background checks. And in there, they basically have said that arrest records and pending records should not be used when screening a tenant. The third misconception here is that we show all criminal records ever. That's also not true. Again, because we are Fair Credit Reporting Act compliant, we can actually only show you a 7-year limit. So basically any crime that occurred in the last 7 years. Once it starts going further back from that, we actually can't show you that. Otherwise, we would not be compliant with the FCRA. Point number 4 is that a misconception that all court records have a social security number. We get this all the time. People think that if we have the social, that should be all that we need to find a match. And it would actually be much easier if that was the case, but fortunately there's a very small percentage of states that will release that social security number information. Most of them keep it either as a partial, so they'll only show 4 digits, or they won't show it at all. And so we do our best to use the social security number in other ways to find a match with the name and date of birth, but the social security number itself is a lot of times not on a court record. The 5th misconception, and possibly one of the riskiest of all, is that you can find criminal information on Google. And this is actually a violation of the FCRA, and also it's usually inaccurate. So if you are going to find the most accurate information, you need to either hire a company like AAOA, or you would need to actually go to the court directly and provide the court the information that you need and even pay the court certain fees to get that information in order to make sure that you have the best. Google is not going to show you the most accurate information, even if you were to find a match. So here, that brings me to this point, which is, when does a criminal record not show up? So the first point here is that it happened more than 7 years ago. So just reiterating again what I was saying before about the FCRA, if it happened more than 7 years ago, it will not be reported. If it was an arrest record or they haven't been convicted yet. So a lot of times people are still going through the trial. And so at that point, again, if it has not been an actual conviction, it does not actually show up. The third one is that the record is sealed, expunged, or discharged. So these are different words that all mean the same thing. Depending on what state you're from, they use different words. But what that means is, as part of the deal, maybe with the actual verdict, or maybe if they're a juvenile, the court will seal the record so that nobody can see it. So that's not just us who can't see it. You wouldn't be able to see it either. Nobody from the public would basically know that it existed. The fourth occasion in which it wouldn't show is if the person gave you the wrong date of birth, name, or social security number. So we're going to be tapping into this pretty soon here with the sneaky tenant tactics. Honestly, if they give you a bad date of birth or name or social, it really makes the search a lot harder. So from there, if that's incorrect, the likelihood of a criminal record not coming up increases. So you want to make sure you have that accurate when you do a search. And then lastly here, if the crime occurred in a different state than the one you requested, it will not show up. So some people call us sometimes and they wonder why it didn't appear in California, but the crime occurred maybe in Nevada or Washington. And so what ends up happening is people who order statewide reports, they end up limiting themselves to just the state. So a lot of times what we end up doing is recommending a nationwide coverage, and that definitely gets all of the states in your search. So here, I wanted to show you a simplified version of how we report the data. So now that you know what we report, here's how we do it. Basically, we take some key data points. So name, date of birth, and social. You guys are familiar with this. If you've ordered any reports on our website, this is what you end up entering in. The first thing we do is we take the social security number and we run what is called a previous address history report. That's what we call PATH. And what that uses is the social security number, and we find any names and addresses that have ever been associated with that number. So what's great about that is that even though most court records don't include a social security number, we can actually use the social security number to find alias names, middle names, and addresses. So for example here, if you were to give us an original application, so this is when you go online, you tell us Betty Smith, you tell us her date of birth and her social, great, we have that information. But then we take that social and we find out that Betty has used a maiden name in the past, Betty Jones. And maybe another time she used a middle name, Betty Ann Smith. And maybe there was another address that she lived at that she didn't tell you about, and we found it because of her social. And here's 456 Oak Avenue. So what results there is an enriched application. So now we have Betty Ann Smith, Betty Ann Jones, and 2 different addresses to search for. So this helps us then have more information that we can actually look. So if you have a Bob, you want to know that your provider, your tenant screening provider, is also searching maybe Robert, if that's his actual legal name. So we've basically put these rules in place so that you get the best criminal and the best eviction records coming back. This is a little oversimplified, but you get the general idea here. So now I want to jump into the 6 sneaky tenant tactics. Now that you know what the key data points are, these will make a lot more sense to you. So a lot of tenants, I want to start by saying this, they do call us sometimes to do their homework. They ask us how these background checks work. Sometimes they even try and run reports on themselves. They're really just trying to find out if the background or if the criminal record is actually going to show up on their report and if they're going to be able to hide that from their landlord. So it's really interesting to get calls from tenants, and here are some of the tactics that we found out that they tend to use. And then here on the right side, I'm going to mention the smart landlord tactics that you can use to basically put up a defense for that. So number one is fake references. And these are in no particular order, but obviously someone who's burned bridges with landlords and employers in the past, they won't want to give you those people as references. So they'll commonly use their friends or family phone numbers, and they hope that they'll basically cover for them. So what do you do as a smart landlord? Well, the thing you could do here is ask for multiple references. So it's harder to fake 3 or 4 references rather than 1 or 2. So when you do that, definitely ask for multiple, and that'll help get you more accurate results. Also, if you are going to call an employer reference, make sure that you don't just call the phone number that the tenant gave you. Try and see if you can find the company phone number online and call and talk to their HR department. That's usually the best way to do it. And then if you're going to call one of their landlord references, we always suggest starting off with, I'm interested in renting out the unit you have available. And if they are a landlord, they'll say, well, I don't have any units available, or which one? So that there would tell you that they are. If they're not a landlord, they will be really confused, and they might even hang up on you or say that you have the wrong phone number. So definitely a smart way to do references is ask for a lot and don't give yourself away right away. The second sneaky tenant tactic. It's a pretty obvious one, but a lot of landlords fall for it, and basically it's when tenants try and be your friend. They try to be extremely flattering, and they make you feel like you don't need to go through the formal procedures because, after all, aren't you all buddies now? But no matter how friendly this person is or how much you like someone, you should treat them the same way as you would any other applicant. So that's something to keep in mind. The other tactic here, which is kind of related, is the sob story. So people will tell you that they've been going through tough times, and that's okay. But you want to see that they've been doing something to improve their life or to improve their finances, and it's not that just because they give you the story that they're going to get a free pass. It's really, you have to look at multiple things to make a decision there. So the smart landlord tactic is trust data, not people. So unfortunately, people lie, but facts and data do not. So using our website helps you see the facts and make a decision based on that. So the third one here is moving in with current tenants. So this is actually a smart one. Tenants sometimes have friends, and those friends might not have the best finances, or they might have criminal records. But they're hoping that if, this tenant that you already have puts in a good word for their friend, that you won't think twice about renting to them. Maybe you won't go through your typical formal protocols, and you'll give them some sort of special treatment. And that actually does happen, and it is a good tactic for a tenant to use. But as a landlord, what you need to do is screen all tenants over the age of 18. And this also goes for co-applicants as well. So a lot of times you'll have a co-applicant with a primary applicant, and landlords will only search the primary applicant. And it is just a major problem if the co-applicant is going to be a financial issue, and you wouldn't even know because you didn't screen them. So make sure to screen all tenants over the age of 18, including all co-applicants, just to be sure. All right, so the next sneaky tenant tactic Fake or deceased social security number. So as we saw previously, a social security number, we use that to pull up previous addresses, alias names, confirm the date of birth. So if they give you a bad social security number, they're probably trying to hide an eviction, maybe trying to hide any criminal records. So a lot of times either the social is fake, so it never has existed. Sometimes it can belong to somebody else, so a junior maybe using the senior's social security number, or it might even belong to somebody who passed away. So what we recommend doing here as a smart landlord tactic is ordering a social security number fraud report. This is going to give you the full history of the name and any variances on the name, the date issued, the state it was issued in, and the date of birth. And that should all match up with what your tenant has given you. So this is a great way to tell whether or not the social security number is the right one. The fifth tactic here is alias names. So obviously some people go by different names sometimes, like a Bob and a Robert. But there are some cases where there are a lot of different names, and that's a red flag typically. So sometimes tenants will give you only the name that maybe has the good information attached to it. So maybe a maiden name or a nickname, hoping that you won't find the other name. So the smart landlord tactic here is to order that previous address history report. Again, I cannot emphasize how important that social is because we use that to find the addresses and the names associated with that social. So if they've used those alias names in the past, we can search those too. So that's important to have in any search that you're going to do. The sixth sneaky tenant tactic, and the last one here, is an incorrect date of birth. This one is extremely important. And basically, if somebody gives you a bad date of birth, it will make the criminal search essentially useless. It's like you're searching for somebody completely different. The date of birth is a key data point in the criminal records. As I was mentioning before, a lot of criminal records don't have a social security number, so we go by date of birth and name primarily most of the time. So it's important to make sure that the date of birth is correct. And how do you do that? Collect multiple forms of identification. It is important to do this so that you know you're searching the right information. And just a quick note here on how to detect identity fraud. If you run that path report and you see no records found, or there's a completely different name on that, that could indicate either the person has no address history because they don't have any sort of record of themselves on the map. Sometimes that happens if they're young or if they just came to the country, but if that's not the case, that's kind of a red flag. Or if there's a completely different name, then the social security number is probably incorrect altogether. Belongs to obviously whoever name is on the report. The second one is the social security number fraud report. If you see a no match or a deceased, that's instantly you already know that that social is not good. So that's an obvious way to get that one. And if no credit report was found. So again, some people might not have a credit report established, and that's not necessarily good or bad, but if they should, then that's a red flag. The other thing too is when somebody does do a credit report, if you guys are using the method where the tenant gets emailed to approve the credit report, they actually have to verify their identity at that point. So if they're not able to do that, then that's probably because the information is bad that they have. So not being able to find a credit report or not being able to get one from the tenant, that's usually because they're trying to maybe hide something there. So the tips here would be collect a copy of driver's license and social security number card. You want to make sure those date of births and names and addresses match up. Ask for a maiden name. Just so that you have that on file, it's important to know what other names they go by. And a middle name. We don't require it on our website, but I highly recommend using it. The more data we have, the better the search will be. A middle name definitely eliminates any false positives and really makes it makes it less likely that you know, that we'll find a result that doesn't match your tenant. So with that said, best-in-class providers of tenant screening, they design solutions to be consistent with your compliance obligations. So what does that mean? Basically, what we try to do with our tenant screening is provide you with information that follows the state laws, the federal fair housing laws, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and the HUD guidance as well. So we try and give you the information that you need that also complies with all of this, the information basically that you're allowed to use and that you should use. So with that said, I want to touch specifically here at the end about HUD guidance. So for those of you that don't know, HUD is the federal agency that investigates allegations of fair housing, which are basically discrimination violations. So HUD actually investigates discriminations against all landlords, the lawsuits against all landlords, not just Section 8 properties or not just public housing. So this actually applies to all landlords. And HUD issued new guidelines on how to use criminal records last year that basically changed the way that landlords should be using criminal records. And these are guidelines, but they are enforced. So if you want to avoid a discrimination lawsuit, you want to make sure that you're making decisions that are compliant with how HUD wants you to use criminal records. So we provide you with the records, but it's your job to make a decision that is HUD compliant based on those records. So why did HUD even do this? Well, they did it to reduce what is known as disparate impact. So this means that basically a landlord can have a completely neutral screening policy. So it's a policy that could apply to everyone equally. So you could say no criminal records, but HUD is now saying that that can be discriminatory because basically you're using results that have a disproportionate impact on a member of a protected class. So U.S. African Americans and Hispanic individuals are arrested and convicted at a higher rate than their share of the general population. So your policy could affect these protected classes more than other people. So having a complete blanket policy that says no criminal records, period, is actually, in a way, having a disparate impact on maybe African Americans and Hispanic individuals. So the question, and people were freaking out about this last year, is can a landlord consider criminal background information at all? Can I even use this and not have a lawsuit against me? And the answer is, well, yes, you can. But instead of declining for all prior criminal records in a blanket policy, you should actually show that you have evidence that you've considered specific things when making your decision. The first one here to look at is how many records were found. So was this a pattern of misbehaviors of criminal records, or was it just a one-time thing? That's important to show as well how much of a safety risk this person could pose. What type of crime was it? So I think I started the example at the beginning with a DUI. Obviously that's not probably that bad when making a rental decision versus physical assault or maybe some sort of violent assault of some other type. So the type of crime here does matter. And when did it occur? Was it many, many years ago where the person has had a chance to rehabilitate? Maybe they've had a job or kids since then and they were young when it happened? Or was it something that just occurred? You'll want to definitely take that into consideration. And lastly, how does this fit in with the rest of the applicant's story? So again, is it just something that happened, a one-time thing? Is this a person who's actually maybe a good person who made one mistake? So HUD is actually the one providing these guidelines. And what I've done is provide you with the HUD guidelines. And so if you actually look at your handouts here on the right, you'll see that there are the exact HUD guidelines, and you know they're a little vague because they're guidelines, but it's definitely important to know that you're calling references, that you're checking their employment situation, their financial history, you're looking at their criminal records, their eviction records, and you're taking all those pieces into consideration, not just the criminal background check by itself. So definitely take a look at those guidelines. The other handout I put in there as well that I hope will kind of make the guidelines a little bit more understandable is an article that was written by an attorney that was a guest author for AAOA last year, right when these guidelines came out, and I think he did a really great job at summarizing and explaining how you as a landlord can stay out of trouble and still use these records. So bottom line, if you deny any and all applicants because of a criminal conviction, you are actually violating fair housing laws. So read the HUD guide, take these guides into consideration, and definitely use them in your screening policy. So with that said, I'm going to take it here to Q&A. If you guys have questions, again, there is a box on the right side of your screen where you can enter in questions, anything related to criminal background checks or just tenant screening in general. If you want to just type that in for me here on the right-hand side, and I'll go ahead and take them as they come. So let's see here what I have. Okay, so this one is from Susan. If I reject or decline an applicant, do I tell them why? So this is an interesting one. We actually have a declination letter. If you guys haven't seen it, it's built into the actual report. So when you get back the results, there's a tab that's called declination letter, and you can actually mark the reason why, and it could be the criminal records. So that's definitely something I would suggest using, just so that it's official and it's in writing, that you know, that's going to be a declination. It's very clear that that's the answer there. Okay, so now let's see, any more questions? All right, here's another one here from Joe. What if an applicant is disputing that the record belongs to them? So this happens sometimes. I don't know if it's that they're being dishonest, or maybe if there is actually somebody with a very similar name that somehow ended up coming up in the search. But if an applicant does dispute it, they can contact us. And that's another good reason to use the declination letter, is that it has instructions on there on how they can do that. And basically what we do is we open up an investigation and we check it out. But for the most part, the records do end up belonging to the applicants in almost all cases. So that's definitely something we can do if you need us to. All right, and let's see, another question here. Can you pull juvenile records? So actually, we usually cannot. And I say that because juvenile records are usually going to be they're going to be expunged, or they're going to be basically not open to the public. So juvenile records are typically not going to show up on a search. It's usually at 18 and older is what ends up coming up, because of most courts don't make that available to the public. All right. I think I have one more question here. What if my applicant doesn't have a social security number? Good point. So this happens every once in a while. We do have an option where you can select to not input the social security number, and that's okay. But as I was stating before, we use the social to get that previous address history report that basically gives us more details that we can search. So yes, we can do it, but the most accurate searches are going to be with the social security number. So if you have one, we definitely encourage you to include that. Okay, so that looks like all the questions we had for today. If you guys think of any other questions, feel free to give us a call and we can help you. A lot of these can be case by case situations. So if you see a record, you want to confirm what it was for and maybe understand a little bit more about it, we are always happy to help you. And lastly, I just want to mention too that if any of you guys are joining today and you want to have access to the webinars year-round for free, I highly encourage you to join as a value member and pay an annual membership. We do provide about 2 webinars per month, and we're also going to be having those recordings available for all of you guys soon. And tomorrow I will go ahead and send you guys an email so you'll have this entire recording there. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful day and take care. We'll be in touch soon with our next webinar in 2 weeks. Have a great day.